What's going on, guys? We are back, baby. We got a brand new Preston Stewart video. Shout out to Preston. Please go show him some love. He's the GOAT. This is the title of this one says the U.S. just flipped on key Iran issues. Now, anybody who's been on this channel following what I'm talking about knows that I've been pretty critical, pretty harsh about the United States' stance on Iran over the last couple of months, ever since they stopped. Um, Attacking Iran and started this ceasefire, which only the United States abide abode abided by the ceasefire. Iran just kept attacking its neighbors and also the U.S. In fact, there was even U.S. service personnel killed during the ceasefire. Anyways, during this whole time, I've been pretty critical about it, and I think it's Americans' civic duties to be critical about this kind of stuff because it's their assets, it's their country, it's their taxpayer dollars that are doing these operations. So, I think Preston and I see on a pretty similar viewpoint regarding this topic. So I'm excited to watch this. But he's much less biased. He's more impartial than I am. I show my bias very strongly, and that's something that I'm aware of, and I talk about in the videos too. Here's little Brew Squee Squee, little Brew Noodle. Sometimes I call her Nipple, and then Nipple turned to Niz. So the most common thing I call her now is Niz. Her name's Brew, but I call her Niz. So yeah, we're gonna watch this. A couple things before we jump into it. We've got our ORC SHASHLIK t-shirts on sale to the end of the month. Thank you for everyone who's picked one up. I believe they're arriving now for the people who have purchased them. So please send me photos. I'm really excited to see what they look like. Make sure they're good quality and everything. Because our other merch that we do from that site is very good quality. So I'm excited. Let me know. And lastly, we've got our members only, our paid YouTube members archive. I just added like another 40 videos or something to the archive last night. It's all of the uncensored content that I used to make back in the day that YouTube has decided is now red flagged. It's bad to have on my page. So instead of deleting all that content, I'm just systematically moving it over to a members only archive. So the members get love for supporting the channel, and also I don't have to delete the content. So it's a win, 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 win. All right, guys. 3 minutes. Also, less swollen, but darker. Getting better. Let's get after it.
Nuclear enrichment for Iran. They had to hand over all of their highly enriched uranium. So 1 week ago, the U.S. stance was zero nuclear enrichment for Iran. They had to hand over all of their highly enriched uranium, and the ballistic missile program had to be destroyed. But now, President Trump has said that it's only fair that Iran keeps their missiles, that we're in no rush to get the highly enriched uranium, and future enrichment is okay for civilian purposes, which is a dramatic change, to say the least, in a pretty short period of time. So if you're confused, just know that I am too. So to help us unpack exactly what's happening.
So this is what I mean. I mean, there's two different types of channels, right? And Preston is so good at what he does, and he's more biased. He says, this is quite a change of stance. This is, if you're confused, I am too, right? He uses words like that, which I respect. And then I say, it's fucking retarded, right? So there's differences to the channels, right? It's to each their own.
Here, we're joined by Ambassador Daniel Shapiro. Dan served as the U.S. ambassador to Israel from 2011 to 2017 and spent time working in the Pentagon, at the State Department, on the National Security Council, and Capitol Hill. But most importantly, I think, is we're both from Champaign, Illinois. How about that for a small world? Now, for context, we recorded this conversation at 9 a.m. Central on Friday, June 19, 2026, just because things are changing by the minute at this point. So be sure to follow the ambassador at the link in the description below. And with that, let's get to the conversation.
Let's get to it.
All right, Ambassador Shapiro, thank you so much for taking the time, sir. I did not think, this is the first time I've ever interacted with a fellow Champaign native on the show, so this is great.
Well, Preston, it's great to be with you. And yes, that is a real pleasure to discover that we have the same hometown, Champaign, Illinois. So I'm looking forward
We're there
to this
at the same time for a little while, at least.
Yeah.
This is solid. All right, well, we'll save that for another time. Champaign, great town, go Illini. Iran. There's a lot happening in the last couple days, and we're recording this the morning of June 19th. Things will undoubtedly change in the next few minutes, definitely a few hours. What can you tell us about the memorandum of understanding that is now in place between the United States and Iran?
Well, this MOU that was announced as ostensibly the end of the war, I have to back up and say, I think is the product of a misguided war. It was a mistake to go into this war with so broad but also poorly defined strategic objectives, really things that couldn't be achieved, that essentially would have required the fall of the Iranian regime, certainly not at any acceptable cost. And then when Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz, they gained all of the leverage. That became the most important interest for the United States to address, which was to get the strait open, to unfurl the global economic chaos and energy crisis that had produced high gas prices and inflation and really was roiling the world economy. That's a divergence, of course, from Israel's interest. We can talk about that separately because they were less focused on the strait, more focused on their concerns about the various threats Iran focused. But that meant that when the president was looking for an off-ramp, belatedly, I think, he really had little leverage and accepted a deal which...
Before we move into more, I don't want to skip this. I want to share you my perspective and hear me out on this because it's maybe a little bit different than the reasoning's probably different than other people with the same viewpoint. I heard somebody say it well on a news interview a few days ago, but he's like, I am a bomb the terrorist type of guy, meaning he thinks it's good when terrorists die. I'm the same. I was supportive of the Venezuela raid and getting Maduro. I'm supportive of smoking that El Mencho and what's going on in South America, and I was supportive of taking out the terrorists in Iran. But one of the differences with Iran for me is Iran gets Russia. I'm in Ukraine, right? Russia gets a very large amount of Shahed drones and Garand style drones from Iran. If Iran's getting absolutely obliterated by the United States and Israel, that means less drones to Russia, which means less drones coming here into the country I'm in, where I have friends and family in Ukraine, right? So that's probably the largest reason why I support getting rid of Iran. Anybody in this what I call the axis of evil. I didn't make that up. I heard it somewhere, and now I say it. Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, right? Any of them getting kicked in their butts, I'm supportive of. I respect Mr. Shapiro's perspective and, of course, Mr. Stewart's.
Turned out to be even a weaker deal. It was always going to be a weak deal because, again, Iran had the leverage, but it turned out to be an extraordinarily weak deal. So what does it provide? It provides for Iran to agree to open the Strait of Hormuz to shipping, and of course the U.S. to respond by lowering or ending the blockade of Iranian ports that it had done in response. And so that's the main issue in phase one, is stripping back through the Strait of Hormuz, try to get that global economic and energy stability restored. But there's a phase two, which would be negotiations over the next 60 days over Iran's nuclear program, in which Iran would address the question of how it would dispose of its enriched uranium stockpile. And they have 10 bombs worth of weapons grade uranium or near weapons grade uranium, and then much more of lower enriched uranium. Some of it's buried after the strikes from last summer. Some of it's not, but it would have to be found and either diluted or exported, and all that would have to be monitored. And whether Iran would agree to a long-term ban on further enriching uranium, which it's not doing at the moment that we know of, but if it started again, could easily rush toward a nuclear weapon. But all it's agreed to is to talk about those things. It hasn't agreed to make concessions on any of those things, and that would only play out over that 60 days and most likely would be extended.
Agreed to talk about. That's such an important part that I think people miss. There's not an agreement to concede or concessions like Mr. Shapiro says. Iran's not saying, yeah, we'll give up our nuclear enrichment sites and our these things that spin them up and I forget what they're called, and get rid of neutralize or get rid of our uranium. No, they're just agreeing to talk about it down the line. And when has talking with Iran ever been beneficial, ever?
Because Iran's very adept at dragging its feet
Negotiating.
in those talks, and then you could have that basically be an open question for weeks, months, maybe even years. The real surprise in this deal was the way the United States agreed to front load a lot of sanctions relief for Iran before Iran has made any of those nuclear concessions. It shows just how much leverage Iran had and how desperate the president was to get the Strait of Hormuz open. So he agreed to unfreeze tens of billions of dollars of frozen Iranian assets so they'd have access to that revenue. Agreed to give us waivers on sanctions against Iran selling its oil on the open market, so it'll have revenue from that. The Iranians also claim that after the initial 60 days, they and Oman, the country that sits across the Strait of Hormuz from them, would work out some joint administration of the Strait of Hormuz. It's really an international waterway. No one should administer it. It should be free navigation there, but they intend to try to derive revenue from that by requiring ships that go through to pay fees of some kind. So there's a lot of benefit for Iran up front, a lot of money that Iran will quickly get its hands on. And no one should expect that Iran is going to use that money to benefit its people, who it has oppressed and suppressed for years and massacred when they protested earlier this year, build hospitals, build schools. No, they will use that money for the things they've always used it for, the things that they're ideologically committed to: missiles, supporting terrorist proxies, things that help them project power, threaten their enemies, threaten Israel with destruction, try to dominate their Arab neighbors. So it's a very weak deal, I think, indicative of a misguided war, bad decisions that gave Iran all the leverage. Even with that, I think it was weaker than it needed to be.
How much do you read into this being a memorandum of understanding versus an actual treaty or something that, like a binding deal? It seems like we're kind of in a weird spot with that.
Centrifuge. That was the word I was looking for when I was doing this. Centrifuge.
Well, it's definitely not a binding deal and a binding treaty. It definitely only really commits the two sides to those first phases, which is opening the strait and all that initial tranche, all those initial tranches of sanctions relief. Everything else after that has to be negotiated. And it's possible it falls apart, right? It's possible that we never see agreements reached on the nuclear restrictions that are mentioned to be.
It will. I don't want to be a doomer, but it will. Every single agreement that's been made with Iran, specific, like with the IRGC or whatever tyrannical supreme leader was in power at the time, has fallen through. That's why this is so absurd to me that we're just expecting this to be different. What is the definition of insanity? Please tell me in the comments. Doing the same thing repeatedly and doing the exact same thing repeatedly and expecting different results, right? That's insanity. We've been doing that for decades with Iran. Why are we playing this game?
Negotiated. It's possible that Lebanon flares up. The MOU says it's a ceasefire that also includes Lebanon, where Hezbollah and Israel have continued to fight, but it's not at all clear that the United States can impose that condition on Israel, which is going to respond if they feel under attack from Hezbollah, and not certain that Iran doesn't want to allow Hezbollah to continue to poke at Israel and keep that on at least a low boil. So, there's lots of ways this can go off the rails, but we will have made a lot of concessions very early. Iran will have gained a lot of benefit, a lot of recognition of its role and the leverage it has to shut down the Strait of Hormuz again if it wants to, maybe to try to get revenue from it even if it stays open. A lot of countries in the region are adjusting to this new reality and trying to sort of de-escalate their own relations with Israel, the Arab states of the Gulf mostly, realizing that Iran has kind of gained influence out of all this. Nothing in the MOU would require Iran to even talk about restricting their ballistic missile capability or their drone capability or the support for those terrorist organizations around the region, the things they've used against many of their neighbors. So there's lots of ways that Iran may feel emboldened by this, that other countries may feel forced to deal with them, and lots of ways that beyond phase one of the strait opening and those first tranches of sanctions relief, things may go off the rails later. But that will require many months of negotiations to determine.
the fact that the big piece here is down the road, like we'll see what comes of the nuclear program. I've seen a lot of attempts to compare this to the JCPOA, and I wonder if it's even worth a comparison at this point, given that it's just a kind of a promise to keep talking. Where do you sit on that?
Yeah, it definitely isn't an easy comparison because the JCPOA was a fully negotiated agreement, ran 160 pages. It took 2 years to reach, required very firm commitments by Iran, and had a whole series of verification mechanisms, and then a whole range of sanctions relief elements that followed that. And it needed to be monitored over years, right? So this is not that. This is just an outline with many, many of those decisions yet to be achieved. But it is almost certainly going to produce, even if it's successful, a weaker outcome than the JCPOA, and probably a worse deal than we could have gotten before the war. After the United States and Israel struck Iran's nuclear facilities last summer in June of 2025, what was called by the United States Operation Midnight Hammer, sometimes called the 12-Day War. The United States had a lot of advantages after that. The Iranian nuclear program was really set back. There was deterrence established. It was kind of able to monitor even remotely to make sure they weren't digging out the enriched uranium or trying to reset up a new enrichment facility. And that was a good situation to negotiate from. And there were negotiations going up right into February of this year to try to get Iran to make much steeper concessions on the nuclear facilities. Now, again, because of the leverage they've gained, because the United States has now used the military option that you use as kind of a deterrent, or you use as a credible backstop to diplomacy. And Iran basically took our best punch and took Israel's best punch and kind of rolled with it. They lost some leaders, they lost some military capability, but they proved that they had a good answer to that. Closing the strait, strikes they carried out against U.S. military bases and Gulf energy targets, missiles against Israel, of course. They showed they had a lot of leverage. So probably the outcome, even if it is negotiated into a full treaty, will be weaker than the JCPOA. But it is too early to really draw that direct comparison.
What he says here is exactly why there's so many Iranian spokespeople, news outlets, stuff like that, claiming that they won the war, claiming that they defeated the U.S. for exactly that reason, because they took what he just said was the United States' best punch, which I don't necessarily believe. I think the U.S. could obviously wipe Iran off the face of the earth, but they did. They took a really hard punch and wore it, more or less, and from Israel, and they're still not agreeing to any of the things that we wanted them to do at the beginning, any of the concessions that we wanted them to make at the beginning of the war. But the U.S. is making concessions to Iran. It does look like a victory for Iran. That's what's frustrating.
What do you think happened here in the last few weeks? Because we went from the language that President Trump has used just in the last 48 hours, I think has thrown a lot of people off, talking about how kind of suggesting, I don't want to take these out of context, but suggesting missiles are okay for Iran because they need to defend themselves. That's so different than where we were just a few weeks ago, that the enriched uranium, I think he said at one point, hinted that it's not that big of a deal because it's hardly usable. Like some of these areas he's shifting on, the reconstruction fund, whoever it comes from, it seems like a 180 plus some. What do you think happened here? Because I'm still a little bit thrown off by how far we moved in that direction.
Yeah, you should be. I mean, I think how we got here was that the president, after the successful strikes on one night, essentially from the U.S. side against Iran last summer, and then the successful extraction of President Maduro from Venezuela in one night in January, left him with the impression that U.S. military power was essentially unlimited and we could impose our will on Iran in very short time. And he thought this was going to be easy. He thought some very intense early strikes together with Israel, decapitating regime, striking against various military capabilities, and Iran would buckle and the regime would fall. He thought this was going to be easy. And then he got stuck when they didn't crumble, when the regime didn't fall, when they had a counter, closing the Strait of Hormuz, imposing an economic chaos on the world, driving up gas prices and inflation at home, posing political risk to him as he gets closer to the midterm elections, striking against U.S. military bases and killing 13 American service members, and striking the Gulf countries' energy infrastructure. He was looking for an off-ramp. And first they found a ceasefire, of course, in April. But, he got frustrated. He got maybe a little bored with the war. It wasn't as fun as it was in the first week or two when he was seeing all the videos of U.S. bombs dropping. He would recognize the political risk he was facing as gas prices stayed high. And so he was kind of searching at that point for an off-ramp. So again, the negotiations that produced this MOU were defined by that, I think, imbalance of leverage where Iran had the most, but it meant he made stark concessions. Now, then you have to justify those concessions. You have to find a way of explaining why you're agreeing to things that you previously said you would never agree to. First of all, he called for unconditional surrender by Iran. This is obviously not that. He called for a complete dismantlement of the nuclear program. That's not guaranteed in this. He said ballistic missiles had to be addressed. That's not addressed in this. So how do you justify that? How do you justify, as you said, a $300 billion infrastructure, a $300 billion reconstruction fund for an Iranian economy still very corrupt, very much led by the same ideologically hostile leadership that wants to destroy Israel, that wants to dominate the Arab countries in the region, that wants to kick the United States out of the region. Nothing's changed about them. You have to sort of rationalize it. So now we're hearing, maybe also he thought that he could install in Iran a leader like Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela, an alternative leader who they could do business with, they could cut deals with, they could, everybody could get rich off of. And so maybe it's sort of trying to shift to that model, even though there's no evidence that these Iranian leaders are really malleable in the same way. But so the justification now is, well, the nuclear materials are buried and not that valuable. That's not true. It's still very dangerous. If Iran were to dig them out and start enriching them, they could sprint to a nuclear weapon. Well, the ballistic missiles, of course, they need some ability to defend themselves. Well, maybe, but they have used those ballistic missiles to shower their neighbors, Israel and Arab states, in very aggressive ways. Well, if Iran would behave like a normal country, we can do business together and we can treat them like a normal country. Sure, that might be true, but everything that they had said previously about a 47-year conflict since the Iranian Revolution, U.S. hostages held, U.S. service members killed in Iraq and Lebanon, neighbors all being threatened by this country. None of that has really changed. So it's not very convincing. It certainly doesn't convince our Israeli partners, and I think many of our Arab partners are unnerved by it, but making the adjustment because they realize that Iran is going to gain a lot of influence coming out of this. It looks a little bit like we're getting our pocket picked by the same Iranian leadership that originally was defined as the enemy we were going to war with.
I feel like Israel has had a bit of a roller coaster in the last few months with their relationship with the United States. All of a sudden, we're side by side leading this war into Iran, something they, at least some of their political leadership has wanted for a long time. And I think it's pretty safe to say poses a larger threat to Israel day to day than it does the United States. And then we turn around and, we had the Houthi ceasefire that we just announced. If I'm not mistaken, there were Israeli jets in the air when we walked out of that one. And now we're backing out in Iran. What does this do you think, short and long term, to the U.S.-Israeli relationship?
Well, the relationship is in a paradoxical state at the moment, as you said. On the one hand, we demonstrated in the early phase of this war, even though I thought this was a misguided war, there is this value of a peer partner that we can do interoperable military operations with against common enemies. And they're very capable, and of course they have intelligence and they have technology, and so there's a lot of benefit to having that partnership. So we've seen the upside to having Israel as part of an anchor of a U.S. military coalition and strategy in the region. The downside, of course, is that our interests diverge. In this case, as you mentioned, they see Iran as an existential threat, and they wanted to continue the war, to continue to degrade that threat, maybe even try to bring down the regime. That was not a U.S. interest. U.S. interest might have been to contain Iran. And, as I said, I think last summer strikes had a pretty good effect to do that. But once the Strait of Hormuz was closed, the U.S. interest was primarily to get that open and get global economic stability restored. And that's a pretty stark divergence of that interest. And so then you have the question of Lebanon. If Iran demands that Lebanon be included in a ceasefire for us to get the Strait of Hormuz open, that gives them a lot of leverage over us to try to impose those conditions on Israel. Well, no Israeli leader, this isn't just about Netanyahu, could fail to respond to attacks by Hezbollah into northern Israel, where since October 7th, or the day after October 7th, since October 8th, Hezbollah has been attacking. Most of those Israeli communities have been evacuated. Essentially, Israel doesn't have effective sovereignty over part of its own territory because people can't live there. So Israel will continue to try to degrade Hezbollah's capability, and that means they want to occupy parts of southern Lebanon. I think that's a questionable strategy for sure, but it's very unlikely that Trump can impose on an Israeli leadership to sort of walk back from that, what they see it defending northern Israel from Hezbollah attacks. But there's broader issues in this relationship too. Obviously, Israel's standing in the United States more generally has declined. Many people on both sides of the aisle, it's sort of heavier probably in the Democratic Party, but it's happening in the Republican Party too, are upset about the extent of the destruction of Gaza and the civilian casualties there, even though there was a lot of sympathy after the October 7th terrorist attacks and understanding of the need to respond, but the extent that it went to, the fact that similar, not to that extent, but very extensive operations have also gone on in Lebanon beyond just hitting Hezbollah military targets, even hitting at times what appear to be civilian areas of Beirut. And then this Iran war, which, was instantly unpopular in the United States, from the very beginning. 60% or so of the public opposed it. That rose. The president never really made much of a case to Congress or to the American people about it, but it was very clear that that was something that the prime minister was advocating. And so, he is going to be associated with that unpopular campaign. And then when this divergence opens up, it really lays bare that we are not always on the same page. And now you've seen something very extraordinary in the last few days. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been sort of under attack by President Trump. He has had profane exchanges with him on phone calls and then told reporters about that. He's called him insane. He's called him the junior partner, kind of very belittling, and he'll do whatever I say. Now Vice President Vance is out kind of saying, calling out extreme Israeli cabinet ministers who I'm no fan of, but calling them out by name and saying, they have no alternative and, they should wake up and smell the reality and realize the United States is their only friend. I mean, there are legitimate criticisms, obviously, but that kind of open public discord between Israeli and American leaders is very unusual and indicative of a relationship that's under a lot of strain, for sure.
And it's exactly what Iran's going for, what Iran's going for. Same thing with Russia and Ukraine in the U.S., right? Russia loves when the U.S. and Ukraine butt heads about support and aid, or when the Europeans and the U.S. butt heads about aiding Ukraine. Russia loves that stuff. Iran loves to see the two people that are kicking their butts fight with each other, like argue with each other. It's part of their game, man.
I feel like an easy thing to point to here is to say our allies won't trust us as much anymore. But we've also hear that every few years. That was the case after Iraq a couple times, leaving the Kurds, and then when we withdrew or left in 2010s, Afghanistan, Ukraine. It feels like time and time again, there's things pointed to as evidence why our allies won't trust us in the future, but they do. I think today they still do, or they want to. Is this any different? Or is this maybe more regional? How does that play in here, or will it?
Well, of course, the United States under President Trump has really proven itself to be much less reliable of an ally than most administrations of both parties have been over decades.
We're on ballistic threat right now. That's why I keep looking at my phone, because there's some MiGs in the air. So I'm just listening, because you don't get much of a heads up when there's a ballistic inbound. With the drones, you can hear it from pretty far away.
That's true in Europe. where the president spends a lot of time criticizing our NATO allies and partners, now talking about significant reductions of U.S. forces there. There's legitimate things to demand that NATO partners do more and spend more in their own defense, but there's a real sense of a devaluing of that alliance. I think many of our Asian allies are feeling some of that same sense of unease about U.S. commitments to defend them. Maybe a greater interest by Trump in cutting some grand bargain with Xi Jinping in China rather than holding the line and containing Chinese ambitions in the region and defending our partners. So that is already happening. Against that backdrop, then, you go into a war like this, which Israel did advocate for, but many of the Gulf states were very uneasy about. They really worried about the damage Iran might do to them and then did to them if this war broke out. Then once they were attacked, several of them adopted a kind of a forward-leaning posture to say, okay, now that you've pulled us into this and they've hit us, you got to finish the job. I mean, you've got to really go forward until the regime is out of business. And then it became clear that Trump had no interest in that. That would have, I think, been a significant overextension of an already misguided war. So I'm glad he didn't. But that really does shake the confidence of Gulf partners in the United States' ability to defend them, which we've proven is shaky at best, and really our long-term commitments, our long-term staying power.
See, I have to disagree a little bit here with Mr. Shapiro, with all due respect, because I believe that the best after the war already started, they committed. There's U.S. forces attacking ground units and assets in Iran. I believe the best course of action is to finish what was started in the sense of completing the original goals, ensuring there's no more enriched uranium, or any way to enrich uranium, any more nuclear sites, anything like that. That was the number one goal. Number two was to handle the regime. It wasn't necessarily regime change, but basically it was saying dismantle the regime so much and hurt them so much that the Iranian people can rise up and handle regime change themselves. And then number three ended up being the Strait of Hormuz, which wasn't even a thing prior to the war. As it stands right now, none of those things have been accomplished. So it looks like the U.S. went in, hurt the Iranians, their Air Force, Navy. Trump says it every time he's on stage. Their entire Navy's at the bottom of the ocean, blah, 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 at the bottom of the sea. They hurt the Iranians, but not enough to complete any of the initial objectives that were set out to be completed. And then effectively is pulling out or pulling away while conceding while conceding to multiple of the Iranian negotiation points, like being willing to, it doesn't sound like it'll be American money, but being okay with Iran receiving upwards of 2 to 300 billion with a B dollars to help rebuild their infrastructure, which everybody in the world knows will just be funneled directly into more defense assets and offensive assets to attacking more people. So my point is, I disagree in this sense, because he said he thinks it's a good thing the U.S. didn't continue action in Iran, because it already felt like a misguided war. And I'm saying I think they should have at least finished the job and completed the objectives, because then you could say, even if people disagreed with the war to begin with, at least the people that agreed with it could say, hey, he got it done, though. Iran's no longer a problem, and they won't be. It's done. Iran is neutralized. But now they can't say that. Iran's still a threat, probably more of a threat than they ever have been. And none of the other objectives were completed, but they're still pulling out and conceding to the Iranians. So it's like a lose, lose, lose rather than a win, win, lose.
President Trump's decision, as you said, to kind of do that 180 in a very short time could easily be understood. We don't know for sure yet, but it could easily be understood as the first step toward basically the United States washing its hands of the region and kind of saying, you know what, we're done. A lot of our military bases were largely destroyed, or we're not going to rebuild them, put those forces back in those places. The Navy deployments have been very, very taxing on that service, and so we need to send ships home to do their refit and their maintenance. And when they come back out, we'll probably need to put them more in the Indo-Pacific region to address Chinese challenges. And good luck. We're cutting a grand bargain with this Iran that somehow is being defined as a viable partner rather than a ideological adversary. And good luck to you. And we'll help from over the horizon, but you shouldn't count on the United States being the leader of a coalition against common threats. I don't know that that's going to happen, but it's certainly not out of the question, and it's certainly in the minds of our Arab and Gulf partners that maybe this is the beginning of the end of that kind of U.S. commitment to their security and to being the convener, U.S. Central Command of a coalition that helps each other and in common defense. So there's a lot of questions in the air, and we'll see, of course, what President Trump wants to do in the next 2.5 years. But his broader inclination, to focus on the Western Hemisphere. At one time, it seemed like China. Now, maybe even a little less on that. But and the tones you hear from Vice President Vance, who may or may not be the future of that party, are we want to do less abroad. We want to spend less abroad. We want to make fewer commitments. We want to have fewer military deployments. Part of why Trump was elected, running against Middle East wars. This war seemed to cut in the opposite direction, but now maybe he's reverting back to that set of themes. So I think the allies in all regions, but now especially in the Middle East, are really asking that question. Do we have the United States as the kind of security partner it's been over decades for the long term, or do we have to prepare to kind of manage this on our own?
It's a lot still up in the air. So the last thing here, Ambassador, if you don't mind, what are you watching over the coming days and weeks to see if this moves in a positive direction or where it goes at all?
I think I'm watching to see whether they can even get the talks of phase 2 underway. The first week or so is supposed to be the opening of the strait, the kind of establishment that normal shipping has been reestablished there. And once that happens, negotiations are supposed to begin on Iran's nuclear program. In fact, they were supposed to begin this weekend in Switzerland. Already the vice president has canceled that trip. It's not clear if it's logistical or because things have really not still been settled on the closure, because Lebanon continues to burn. And, there was a strike yesterday that killed some Israeli soldiers. Israel has responded. Maybe in the last hour or so, we're hearing talk of a new Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire, but that's very, very unstable. Any of those factors could mean that phase 2 never even gets underway. And if phase 2 never gets underway, then this whole MOU is very, very, very shaky. Even if it gets underway in talks, as I said before, Iran will take very early possession of a lot of revenue and assets that it wants, and it may find that it's very not unmotivated then to reach any kind of final agreement on restricting its nuclear facilities. So I think there's a lot of questions about whether phase 2 even happens. This is, of course, also going to play out one more point here against the backdrop of an Israeli election campaign. It's an important issue because Prime Minister Netanyahu is under a lot of pressure, very unpopular for lots of reasons, is going to be, looking for ways to demonstrate to the Israeli people that he will stand firm for Israel's security, even if that means he has to fight with President Trump. He was going to run as President Trump's best friend, but that's all been shaken up by the exchanges of the last week or two. But that could make him be more aggressive in Lebanon, maybe in Gaza, maybe again against Iran. Hard to do that without U.S. support. But there are internal political factors that could kind of add fuel to the regional dynamic as well.
It's whiplash. Every day, there's just more and more chaos.
Whiplash.
Ambassador, thank you so much for keeping up with all this and then sharing your thoughts with us today.
Preston, my pleasure. Happy to do it anytime.
All right, so thank you so much to Ambassador Shapiro for taking the time to walk through all of that. It's it's a little bit overwhelming. How much is at play here? It's not just the U.S. deal with Iran, but it's the Iranian response. It's the U.S.-Israeli relationship. It's how we're viewed in the broader Middle East, what our future plans look like for the region, and how our allies around the world, and adversaries for that matter, are going to respond. So it's a lot, and really appreciate the ambassador taking some time to walk through all of that with us. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.
Love it. Check out Preston. Please. I'm just going to end it with this and kind of piggyback on that his point about the whiplash. And one of the most frustrating things to me, and it first started for me in Ukraine, is especially at the beginning of the war, every other month there was new talks about how the war was almost over and how Putin is ready for a deal and Zelensky's ready for a deal and America's putting a deal together for Ukraine and Russia war to end every other month. And it's like, dude, just stop the disinformation to push news stories or to try to save the stock market or your interests in different regions. Stop the BS. Give the real news. They are going to fight until one of them is completely dead. That's it. Period. And I see the same thing here with Iran and Israel and the U.S. I don't know. We'll see, though. Please let me know what you guys think in the comments. I got a hairball to handle. I love you guys. We'll see you in the next video.